Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro. Today we're starting our fundamentals series with Rye Whiskey. Hey everyone, Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. Thank you for coming. I am hoping to start a new series today that's a little different than usually what I do. Typically, I'm reviewing spirits, I'm reviewing coffees, I'm digging into the nuances of flavor notes and qualities and comparing them to other products. But I also want to create a space for relative newcomers to the world of whiskey and the world of spirits generally. Now, wait a minute, before you turn away, experts in the world of spirits. I'm also going to include information and tastings along the way that are going to be things you're going to want to see. So this should be a series for the most experienced drinker and the novice trying to learn about the area. So today we're starting off this series with Rye Whiskey. Now, let's talk about rye grain before we get into the whiskey. Rye grain is a cereal grain, much like wheat or barley, and it's often grown actually in the fall to create ground cover in the winter. It can be very hardy. It's hardier than most other grains in the cereal family, so it can grow in clay or sand or maybe even a drought climate. So it's a pretty versatile grain. It's very hardy. Part of the value of the grain is preventing the weeds from spreading in the winter. Winter hardy weeds could take over a field very easily. Early in America's history, in Pennsylvania and Maryland, places like that, a lot of the people were sustenance farmers. They were just farming grain so that they could live. And part of that process would include protecting against those winter weeds, so they would grow rye grain. The use of that grain becomes more difficult though when you own a lot of land or when you're growing a lot of grain. You can't turn it all into rye bread or different other foods. You have to find a way to preserve the grains that you've grown. That was a very common thing at the time and is part of the birth of American whiskey, is trying to find a way to use and preserve the grains that you've grown that go beyond what you can sell and beyond what you can consume. Now, a lot of different countries produce rye grain and will make rye whiskey, but I'm gonna mostly focus on United States today. I've got one rye whiskey here from Canada, but the US regulations on rye whiskey are relatively strict. Rye whiskey has to have at least 51% rye grain. The rest are typically going to be either wheat or corn or barley, usually corn and barley. Like other kinds of whiskeys, once you have your grains laid out, you turn those grains into beer and then you distill them. That's essentially the process of making whiskey without getting too far into the details. Now, apart from the mash bill, which is sort of the name for different proportions of grains in a whiskey, American rye must also be distilled to not lower than 80% alcohol. Once it's been distilled to 80% or below, it then must be cut, typically, to be barreled. Now, it can only enter the barrel at 125 proof, which is 62.5% alcohol. The barrels must also be charred new oak barrels. That is a requirement for bourbon, and it's a requirement for American rye. This is unlike Scotch and other kinds of whiskey where you can reuse barrels again and again. In America, you can't do that to call your product a bourbon or a rye. It has to be freshly made, charred, and used once. Now, there's also the term straight. You might see straight rye whiskey on a bottle. That means that the whiskey is at least 2 years old and that no other spirits have been added to it. So as you can see, the requirements are actually pretty strict to make something called American rye. There are a lot less regulations in the Canadian rye world, which we will talk about when we're trying the Crown Royal I've got in front of us. But let's get started on the tasting, because that's really the point of this channel for me, is trying different whiskeys, comparing them, and talking about the profile we find. I'm going to do a video in the future that specifically talks about the tasting process, but today I'm just going to dig right in. Now, while I'm pouring this, I'll go ahead and tell you that these glasses are called Glencairns. If you haven't used them before or seen them before, they are a whiskey tasting glass. I've got my own brand, the Drink Pro glasses, available on my website, and the link is in the description. But these glasses really help focus the scent of the whiskey upward and into your nasal passages, so you can really pull all the different notes out of a whiskey, which you're not going to be able to do out of a standard rocks glass. Usually on the nose and on the palate, rye is going to add a sharpness, a pepperiness sometimes, a spice or a sharp grain note. Those are the things you're going to find from ryes. And so higher percentage ryes, you might get more and more of those kinds of notes. What I've got in front of us today is actually a variety of different kinds of ryes, not only in the process, but also in the mash bill that I talked about earlier. Sazerac Rye, the first rye we're starting with today, is a pretty well-known one, mostly because people have heard of a Sazerac cocktail. The Sazerac cocktail was essentially a delivery mechanism for this kind of whiskey, for Sazerac rye. Sazerac Rye is the lowest percentage of rye legally allowed by law to be called a rye. It is 51% rye, 39% corn, and 10% malted barley. Now, Sazerac Rye in this form is not age stated, which means we don't know how long the whiskey in this bottle was actually in the barrels. It could be between 4 years and 6 years from what I've read online, but it's important for you to know that if you want to know exactly how old the whiskey is you're drinking, look for an age on the bottle. If it doesn't say, it's non-age stated, and your guess is as good as mine. Now, Sazerac is currently one of the biggest whiskey producers in the world. They own Buffalo Trace, which is a very well-known, very common brand. But this whiskey is going to be very different from a lot of standard Buffalo Trace products. That rye really shows up, and for me, on the nose at least, I get this really nice floral component. There's definitely a sharp grain note. It's almost like hops with beer, but a little bit more grainy and a little bit less floral, to my nose at least. But this is a nice light whiskey on the nose. It's citrusy, it's slightly floral. You definitely can smell the grain component. The rye is prominent, but it doesn't show up as a pepper on the nose. It's not too sharp for me. Part of that also is this is a relatively approachable rye. It's 45% alcohol. It's not going to kick you in the face, but it's tasty. At least we're going to find out and see if it is. Smooth, easy drinking whiskey. A lot of whiskey snobs hate the term smooth, but I think it's actually a really valuable descriptor. If you want to talk about how easy it is to drink a whiskey, you need to use words like smooth or sharp or biting. And one of the interesting things about ryes is that when you have a smooth rye, that's not always a good thing because you kind of want that spiciness, that pepperiness, sometimes even a burn like a literal chili pepper. But going back to the nose after tasting it, I definitely get almost a caramel. You know, the fact that it's only 51% rye really shows up. You can tell that this has a lot of other things going on. The floral note's prominent, the grain note is prominent, but there's very little of the pepperiness or the sharpness or the bite that you would expect from the rye spice on the palate. It's still pretty squarely in bourbon territory in terms of flavors for me. Vanilla, caramel, things like that. There's a lot of herbal qualities on the mid-palate into the finish. I like to do tastings in sort of 3 different areas. You know, the initial first taste, which is the start of the palate, into the mid-palate, which is a small evolution that'll happen on your palate, and then after you've swallowed it, you get this sort of finishing notes, which can be very different from the start of a tasting. And for me, the finish on this is relatively short, but is slightly peppery and slightly oaky. The mid-palate is where the rye really stands out. You take the sip, you get this nice sweet note. It's very vanilla caramel. It's very standard bourbon. And then there's this switch that happens, and it shows up as this nice peppery rye flavor. Now, I promised I would also talk about Canadian rye, and here's the opportunity. This is Crown Royal's Noble Collection. This is a blended Canadian rye. It's 16 years old. It's also 45% alcohol. One of the things that's kind of fun about this is Canadian law doesn't really have any requirements when it comes to how much rye is in a rye whiskey. Most people making Canadian rye are just using a small portion of a high rye mash bill whiskey and blending it with what is a more standard corn-forward American whiskey profile. This whiskey is unlike that though. This is a 90% rye mash bill and is aged for 16 years. So note, it's going to be a lot older than this Sazerac Rye, and it's going to have a much higher rye content. So those are really important things to note when you're looking at flavor. You're going to get more oak because it spent more time in the barrel. I can tell you right about it. I don't even have to taste it or smell it. Those are factors you can pull right off the shelf without having to taste it to educate yourself before you buy. Some places let you try before you buy. A lot of places don't though. So make sure you know what you're buying. Although the Canadians don't have any requirements for the amount of rye grain in the whiskey, they do have requirements for aging. It must be aged at least 3 years in barrels that are no larger than 700 liters. That's 185 gallons American. But other than that, it's kind of a free-for-all in Canada. They don't have a lot of regulations around their whiskey. I applaud Crown Royal for, in this case, actually labeling their product, going beyond what the government requires them to state, and telling you, this is what's in this whiskey. I'm gonna put an age statement on it. I'm gonna tell you the mash bill because you deserve to know. I respect that. And already, I tell you what, the much higher rye profile really shows up when you compare them side by side. These two are the exact same proof, which I think is really important when you're comparing whiskeys. You know, they're both 45% alcohol, but this one now smells almost thin compared to the older, oaky, or more robust Crown Royal we've got here. For me, this Crown Royal really has this nice high citrus note. It's sweet, it's floral, it's citrusy. It kind of reminds me of like a tropical paradise, which is not what I would expect from a Canadian whiskey. But it's interesting to me because you get a lot more of the grain notes on this younger whiskey. That's pretty standard. Younger whiskeys are going to be more grain forward. You're going to get more barrel notes out of an older whiskey. So the grain qualities of the rye really calm down from this 6-year, probably maybe 4-year Sazerac Rye into the 16-year age-dated Crown Royal. The wood shows up. You get a lot more of the vanillin and the tannins from the oak, which are just different compounds that make the oaky flavor, the vanilla flavor. The rye spice moves from that grain profile and even kind of moves away from the peppery or even hops characteristics that I mentioned earlier and just becomes this sort of nice citrus note. Now let's taste it. Oh yeah, now this one is way spicier. While this one had almost bourbon qualities, this Crown Royal Rye is very peppery on the tongue. I kind of end up doing that smacking my lips thing because the mid palate and finish are very spicy, very peppery. It's like black pepper, quite literally, in my mouth. It does dissipate relatively quickly, and there's this sort of nice vanilla overtone that keeps it from being too overwhelming. It's also low proof, which I think helps for this particular pour. And it also keeps that oak quality there. So it's oaky, it's peppery, it's got a little hint of vanilla and some sweetness, but it's very well balanced as a whiskey. This is one of my favorite Canadian whiskeys on the market right now. One of the most important things for me about this Crown Royal is the age shows up right away on the palate. The first thing you taste is sweet oak, and it kind of evolves into this nice peppery, slightly citrusy, slightly herbal, but mostly pepper and wood mid palate into the finish. Whereas this much younger and lower rye profile has a little bit more of a soft entrance to the rye flavors, and then it gets a little bit more grainy as it comes from that vanilla caramel, and it dissipates much more quickly. The pepper and the oak on this linger. And that's what you're gonna get from a lot of older whiskeys, a longer, more complex finish. It will stick with you after tasting it for a long period of time. Now, I talked about the difference between the low rye and the high rye, but the difference here is a little bit more complex than that because we're going from American whiskey to Canadian whiskey, which has totally different regulations. And we're also going from a relatively young pour, 4 to 6 years, to a much older pour, 16 years. So let's pivot and compare apples to apples, at least a little bit more closely. This whiskey here is a Rye West product. It's called Double Rye, and I'll tell you why it's named that. This particular bottle was given to me by a fan of the show who has chosen to remain anonymous, which means I get to show my fun little anonymous animation. If you're new to the channel, people give me whiskeys or different spirits all the time. I try to review them as quickly as I can, and I really appreciate everyone who helps keep this channel going. So if you've got something you want me to review, reach out to me. Here's my email address. We can make it happen. We'll find a way to make it work. Now, the Rye West Double Rye is actually a blend of 2 different ryes, which is why they call it the Double Rye. It's a blend of a 95-5, which is 95% rye, 5% malted barley, that was selected from MGP. You're gonna hear that name a lot in the whiskey world. MGP is one of the largest distillers in the world, and a lot of companies that are trying to source whiskey that they want to bottle or modify themselves will buy from MGP. This whiskey is a blend of 2-year to 7-year barrels, and some of those barrels are the 95-5 MGP whiskey, and some of them are the whiskey made by Rye West themselves. Now, they have a 100% rye in this blending, but the rye is a mix of 80% standard rye and 20% malted rye. So it's gonna be 100% rye, but those ryes have a little bit of a different characteristic to them. Now, this particular version of the Rye West Double Rye was actually a selection that was done by a group called Bourbon. There are a lot of different bourbon groups out there in the world. Lots of them are on the internet. So this one came from Reddit, Bourbon. That's the Reddit / and then the name of whatever the group is. So this is kind of a fun one because the internet picked this barrel. And wow, the grain on this is so prominent. You see that from these younger whiskeys, that really sharp rye grain. The citrus becomes a lot more prominent on this Sazerac compared to this. It is just bursting with like tropical fruit. It's very citrusy, it's very floral. I'm getting a lot of geranium notes out of this. I think those floral notes for me really come from that rye grain. But this thing is just honeysuckle and citrus and herbal. It is just such a rye bomb. If you want to know what rye whiskey that's young tastes like and smells like, I'm betting this is a really good example. All right, let's give it a taste. Now I should add that this is only 1% more alcohol than these two. It's 46 as opposed to 45. And man, it's so much stronger. That pepper is really strong on the palate, mid-palate end of the finish. It's legit like taking a pepper shaker and putting it in your mouth, kind of. It's that kind of strong pepper. But early on in the palate, you get tons of this grain flavor. It really tastes almost like a rye bread in a way. But it's so citrusy. So it's this rye bread component, very strong honeysuckle and geranium and lemon, like a lemon zest, maybe even some orange in there. Very tropical to me. Now what's interesting is as I continue to drink this, I get more and more used to that pepper flavor. So whereas my first taste or second taste was very distinctly black pepper, mid-palate to finish, that becomes a little bit quieter and quieter as I keep going back to it. And what comes in its place, instead of black pepper, now I get a really notable like spearmint note. The citrus definitely remains. The herbal qualities definitely remain. It's a very nice balanced whiskey, but it's miles apart from either of these two. It's so funny, going back to the Sazerac, it is so much more bourbon-esque, so much more vanilla and caramel, much softer, much rounder. This is sharp and narrow and almost tinny in terms of its flavor quality. So it's such a cool, interesting side-by-side. All right, now we're gonna take a real left turn. I've talked about these three different ryes a lot, and I wanna focus a little bit on that 95.5 mash bill. The MGP 95.5 mash bill became sort of world-renowned as the rye profile. Everybody, would you ask, what is a rye whiskey? That's what they will tell you it's supposed to taste like. And that's sort of a narrow view of rye. Rye should be broader than that. But it became so popular. And I think part of the popularity, at least in very recent years, is its use in other ways. You know, whiskey doesn't just have to be presented as it is. And that's why we're moving to Angel's Envy. Now, Angel's Envy has a finished rye, which is a sourced MGP rye, 95.5 mash bill, that classic mash bill, but instead of blending it with their own product like what Rye West has done, they have aged it for 18 months in rum barrels. Now, there's a lot of different finishing that goes on where you take a product and then you put it in a different kind of oak for an extended period of time. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that changes the profile here, because these two ryes on paper should be relatively similar. I'm betting they're not going to be, though, even though the age is the same, the MGP factor is the same, the mash bill is the same. There's going to be some major differences, not just because Rye West added their own distillate to this one, but because this one has 18 months in a rum cask. Also, shout out to Joe Brown for this sample. I appreciate it, my man. So let's go ahead and nose this. Now, right off the bat, it's a huge influence of that rum cask. It is very rum forward. It is sugarcane all over. And one of the things I talked about from this young MGP was a lot of that citrus note. That pairs so well with that rum quality. So you get the sugar cane, you get this nice citrus note. It's very tropical. Again, I talked about how tropical this was. That rum quality adds an additional dimension. It's almost like a pina colada on the nose. It is sticky, syrupy, sweet, and it's kind of overpowering, to be honest with you. Now, when I compare this to the Rye West, I actually get a lot of the same notes, to be honest. You know, I think this one has a little bit more grain forward, which makes sense because it's got that added 100% rye, and it also is using younger distillate between 2 and 7 years as opposed between 6 and 7, I believe. But like, the difference is really that rum finish. You can smell it. You get brown sugar, molasses, sticky syrup sweetness, maybe a bit of coconut that wasn't showing up as much on the Rye West product. But when I do them side by side, I really very strongly prefer the the Angel's Envy, only because it's more complex. The depth really shows up. I mean, as much as I love a citrusy, bright, interesting whiskey, my home is still in bourbon, and that sticky, syrupy sweetness from the rum combining with the rye reminds me a lot of an older caramelized flavor in a bourbon. Let's go ahead and taste this. Yeah, now see, here's where the problem lies. This thing is almost like drinking simple syrup, or almost like drinking rum. It is so damn sweet. It's got a beautiful brown sugar note. It's got a lot of nice barrel notes. You can taste a lot of oak in it, but it's sweet oak because of that rum influence. Yeah, butterscotch, caramel, brown sugar. I get sort of hints of hints of that citrusy note, and then the black pepper does show up on the finish. That's pretty much, though, the only way I know it's a rye. I know this is a rye because of that black pepper finish. Nothing else rye-like is showing up for me. It's very, very little herbalness. All of that rum just overpowers the herbal and becomes super caramelized, sugar sweet. Whereas if I compare that to the High West, then this one feels almost too grainy. It's almost like combining those two would be sort of the ideal situation. That's really funny. When I combine the High West and the Angel's Envy finished rye, I actually get something I like better than either one separately because they're both missing something. This one's missing a low end, a deep sweetness, which I think this kind of gets some of that oakiness from that finishing process. And this one I feel like is missing the actual rye. It's missing that grain note, it's missing that floral note, it's missing the herbal note. It's just sugar, oak, and pepper. So you put these two together and you get a really good process that blends into a delicious rye whiskey. All right, guys, now this is the moment a lot of my whiskey heads have been waiting for. If they watch the videos straight through, then they were spending a lot of time hearing things they already knew, which is fine, and I'm very glad that they did that. But some of them are gonna jump ahead because I'm putting time codes in the description, and they've jumped ahead to this moment because this whiskey right here, Jack Daniel's Single Barrel 2020 Special Release Rye Whiskey. Now this is much higher proof than anything else I've tried before. This is all 45, 46. I think I forgot to mention the Angel's Envy Rye is 50% alcohol by volume. This bad boy though is 130.5 proof. It's 65.25% alcohol. And I'm gonna do a fresh crack on this one, which also sort of means it's gonna be the highest proof point possible. Typically, when you are opening a whiskey, you wanna let it breathe for a while. And what that will do is give it a chance to open up. A lot of times whiskey that's been in a bottle for too long, ooh, that's a good sound. Whiskey that's been in a bottle for too long will sort of condense in terms of its nose and its flavors, and you're not gonna get quite the full experience. But I'm not too worried about that today because I've got a whole bottle. Now I already explained this is very high proof whiskey. It's 65.25% alcohol compared to these 45 to 50% pours. So it's gonna be a lot hotter, and it's a neck pour, which means the alcohol will be at its most sharp and aggressive. But this mash bill is sort of perfectly balanced in between the 95.5 mash bill or the 90% mash bill and the 51%. This is 70% rye, 18% corn, 12% malted barley. Now, right off the bat, this is a beautiful whiskey. Now, I get this very nice banana bread quality. Definitely get oranges and citrus and brown sugar. I get some molasses on this and honey. I almost get like maple syrup as well. There's so much nice sweet aromatic combined with that citrus note and that fruity note, that almost tropical note. And then the baking spices show up too. That's why I think this is a really good mash bill, because going too high on the rye for me cuts out a lot of really fun elements. But going too low on the rye leaves something to be desired in terms of the spice or the herbal note. There's sort of a nice middle ground you can get to where you get the right age. I think this is gonna be older than 7 years and probably younger than 16. I think if you get to the right age and you get to the right combination of grains, you're gonna bring it the best of all the worlds. You're gonna get baking spices and sweet aromatics and citrus and herbal notes and oak, and all of these things combine and create a beautifully well-balanced pour. And I think that's what I'm getting out of this Jack Daniel's rye. The cereal grain definitely shows up. I can smell the rye grain for sure. But I also get that citrus, and I already talked about the banana notes and the bready notes and the cinnamon. And as I keep letting it open up, the citrus becomes a very fruity note. There's a lot more fruit in this than I would say in any of these others. When I grew up, I picked black raspberries with my grandma in her garden. And the black raspberries themselves have the nice sweet berry note, but the herbal quality of the vines themselves is a different smell. And that's what I pick up on this. It really reminds me of home, and it's freaking awesome. Obviously, it's much higher proof, but it doesn't drink that much hotter. A lot of times higher proof whiskey will sort of suck all the moisture out of your mouth and just really leave you, needing some water. But this one doesn't really do that. The high proof shows up. I mean, the flavors are much more concentrated and sharper, and this finish is almost got like a dough quality. It's kind of funny. It really feels like I took a bite of like rye bread dough before it had been cooked. And the black pepper and herbal notes really show up in the mid palate into the finish. I think on that first taste, you get a lot of that sweet aromatic, It really is like the prominent note right off the bat is citrus and sweetness. Then you sort of get into this nice black pepper, herbal quality. And then I really get that, I get oakiness, I get black pepper, and I get that rye bread dough on the finish. That is a weird specific note, but it is really showing up for me. I mean, it's the winner by a mile, to be honest with you. This is the best whiskey I've tried today by a lot. Not just because it's higher proof, but because it's a perfect blend of complexity from both the rye grain components and the more standard bourbon components, which are corn and malted barley. Just a beautiful blend of flavors and just the way you want it presented. It's the right age, it's the right proof. Honestly, I like the high proof stuff. But it doesn't feel overwhelming at all. And honestly, even some of these earlier pours felt kind of overwhelming because it was one note so sharply, so aggressively. Balance is the name of the game when it comes to whiskey. That's it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're new to the channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Click that bell for notifications. I really appreciate everyone who supports me in this endeavor. So if you want to send me whiskey, send me an email. If you really like the channel, you want to support the channel even further and get extra bonus content, consider joining my Patreon. That's where I'm gonna make sure I send out samples on a regular basis. You have a chance to get your hands on some rare bottles on a regular basis. Lots of cool stuff up there. And I've also got a merch store, thedrinkpro.com. So I hope you enjoyed everything we did today. I look forward to doing more of these fundamental videos in the future. And if you liked it, throw a comment down there and tell me how much you liked it. If you want to see something else in a fundamentals video, put a comment down below. I know some of you whiskey folks want to learn about other spirits, and I'd be happy to do a video like that. So let me know what you want to see, and we'll make it happen. All right, everybody, I'm going to get out of here. And as always, you all keep drinking like professionals. Cheers.